when I think of this idea of like the embodied, like it happens like all over the body, or maybe like different parts of the body are contributing to the emergent reality of consciousness. I think also of something that a lot of scientific minded people are very skeptical of. So all the literature around chakras and things like the kind of like very new agey. And I understand a lot of these people, like when they start talking about science and they start going into the quantum realm, a lot of people roll their eyes and they're not like impressed with that. And on the other side, I think a lot of academics, like, what do they do all day? They sit and they think. Like they're not hiking, they're not fighting, they're not super connected to their bodies, it doesn't seem. But from your perspective, this idea that cognition happens in many places in the body. So I don't know, I think of like an energy center where there's a lot of neural connections, like the heart or the gut or these other major sort of centers in the body. It would seem to me that in an embodied consciousness frame, that it would be maybe a little bit easier to conceive of something like, like the chakra literature or something like that, right?
Yeah, well, Fred, you just definitely lit up something in my thinking right there. Yes, possibly. Yeah, there's very interesting, science out there that is now sort of like revamping or maybe giving a little bit more validation or credence to some of these older views. By the way, just in general. Some of those things it's confirming and validating, and then science disconfirms and invalidates other things, right? Even within the same framework, right? And I want to emphasize it's not only that the body plays a major central and constitutive role in forming consciousness and cognition and thinking and decision making and that kind of thing, but it's also movement, right? It's the way the body interacts with the world and shapes the world. And I cup an ear to hear better, and like that kind of thing. So it's the environment too that then shapes us. So it's this bi-directional coupling. It's like that's the key word, right? It's a relational thing.
It's a relational thing with the environment. So it's not just ever in the body. It's a much more multifaceted phenomenon than just like neurons firing in the brain. It's not just the body, but it's also the environment.
Yeah, it's a brain, body, environment, system, and coupling. Out of that comes this self-organization thing of consciousness and cognition. That's what I would say. Back to a little bit of a personal story. I started with Eastern philosophy, right? So I started with, that's what really was passionate. I was passionate about Zen Buddhism. I was passionate about Zen philosophy and Eastern ways of thinking. Then I got into Western philosophy. I ended up doing my master's in Western philosophy. And what really inspired me way back now, is this connection between quantum physics and consciousness. So quantum consciousness, I was like, wow, you have quantum physics, which is incredibly crazy and mind-blowing, and we can't still interpret the results yet. Still many open unanswered questions. And people were like trying to explain consciousness with that. Like we shape our own reality. And I was really into that movement, really, really into it.
The Joe Dispenza stuff of like, you enter the quantum realm and then everything is possible.
Yep, Gary Zukov, Fred Alan Wolf, these were actual physicists and neuroscientists who studied these kinds of things. And then there were and then Erwin Schrödinger. My God, Erwin Schrödinger, one of the fathers of quantum physics, wrote a book called What is Life that enormously inspired me. Created molecular biology with that book, pretty much. And Erwin Schrödinger was a guy who studied the Upanishads and Vedic texts and tried to himself. Werner Heisenberg wrote a book called Physics and Philosophy. Werner Heisenberg, of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle in quantum mechanics.
And Breaking Bad.
And Heisenberg in Breaking Bad, the black hat. Good. So those guys were really inspiring to me. And I think there's still a lot of open answered questions. And then I wrote a book. I read a book called Zen in the Brain by Austin. So this understanding of Zen philosophy by looking at neuroscience. And so I got into Western philosophy, got my master's in Western philosophy with a little bit of little learning from the East as well still. And then it became clear, I think, that there was no quantum mechanics and quantum physics, how interesting it is. It really doesn't have much to say about consciousness. I think people still disagree. Roger Penrose, Stuart Hameroff. There's quantum realm and there's the classical realm, and I think we have to think about consciousness in the classical realm, maybe non-locality, superposition, entanglement, uncertainty, all of those things do matter for consciousness, but maybe not. It's certainly not in the way that people were thinking about, like the Joe, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, the Joe Dispenzas that continue to promulgate these ideas. I think that's been largely, overwhelmingly, we've moved on from that.
It's hard to follow those leaps sometimes, right?
In my opinion.
Yeah, of course. I mean, who knows ultimately, but it's hard to follow those leaps that like these things happen in the quantum realm, and then like this is what it means to you. It's like, well, that's kind of a huge leap, right? I mean, we can use things as metaphors. We can maybe approach certain environmental challenges or personal challenges through the use of metaphors or certain ideas, but it doesn't sort of necessarily dictate. If you're going to apply a little bit more scientific scrutiny to it, sometimes it's hard to follow that chain. And for me, it kind of invalidates, and then oftentimes it'll be connected to certain practices that could be maybe amazing, like in their own right. But it's like the theoretical chain, and then the practice, and then I'm just like, okay, like I don't really understand.
I just think that we should keep those things separate. That's all. Like we shouldn't try and explain one with the other, because it's turned out pretty fruitless and pretty empty. Anyway, to answer your question, the metaphysics of it, right? Like there's a lot of different metaphysical systems of explanation. There's scientific systems of explanation. And in my opinion, those two things diverge. They diverge quite starkly and quite profoundly when trying to explain reality. And some of the but science is now confirming meditation, the contemplative neuroscience, the neuroscience of meditation is now really answering a lot of very interesting questions that people thousands of years knew. Transgenerational epigenetics is another field that's like, wow, like there are deep connections of our ancestors, and we're going to learn a lot more things. But now back to like certain metaphysical, but even within metaphysical, like this was the problem. I read a book called The Tao of Physics by Friedrich Capra. And that book enormously inspired me. And he tries in that book to connect Eastern mysticism with quantum physics. But even within Eastern mysticism itself, you have, with one view, you have like differing ideas and philosophies and theologies. So like, again, it's hard to like extrapolate and match those things. More, what we're actually doing is like, we're coming with confirmation bias. We're coming to the world with what we want to be true and figuring out what we know to try and say, yep, look, that's true, rather than the scientific outlook and the scientific attitude is coming to the world like, let's figure out let's keep an open mind, let's figure out what's true. And if it disagrees with some of our deeply held worldviews, we have to accept that. And that's been shown, I think, time and time again, right? Like Darwin with evolution, like, separated, like humanity's at the top, it's qualitatively distinct. Nope, we're not a matter of difference in degree. We're not a difference in kind. We're just a difference in degree, and we're part of this entire ecosystem. Copernicus did it with taking the sun, the Earth out of the center of the solar system, and the sun is the center of the solar system, and we're just one solar system now among many of hundreds of billions of exoplanets out there in many galaxies. Like, I think there's a lot of times science cuts through the anthropomorphism, in my view, that people like, who have with quantum physics have followed that sort of followed that way of thinking. So with chakras, that's a global level answer. Let's get back to your specific question about chakras and things like that. Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that there are different parts of the body that may not hold like memories and aspects of our personality. That's up here, and that has to be thought of. But we can't make the distinction now with embodied cognition, right? And so in some ways, embodied cognition actually aligns more with chakra philosophy, right? And in many ways, it might be metaphorical, but it's that way of thinking that embodied cognition may confirm.
Yeah, that's it. Like after that, like we sort of layer this representational model, right? That's kind of like has a lot of theory built into it. Who knows how much of it is true, how much of it is not true, right? But I'm thinking also with embodied cognition, it's such a rich frame, because something like, for instance, like meditation, okay, where you're doing something with your body, you're doing something with your mind, you emerge from it with a meaningful experience. I remember personally when people who were scientifically minded thought that that was all like new
Right.
agey like bullshit. Okay. And it turns out today, as you've said, like it's been proven now we can neuroscientifically prove what's that a lot is going on with meditation, and then all the sort of the benefits to well-being, concentration, stress, anxiety, all of that. So it turns out that the people who sort of held on to that as a meaningful experience were correct. In a sense, they were more scientific because they were embodied in their cognition. They had a meaningful experience. The theoretical models of science at the time didn't fit with their experience, but they believed in their experience. It was like empirical.
Oh yeah. Oh yes.
So it's like more scientific almost than like, well, the scientific sounding theory of the world. Yeah, but that's just a theory. Who knows? That's just a paradigm. Maybe eventually we're going to completely transcend that paradigm.
So that's the anti-realist position. And this extrapolates too. Like this extrapolates to things like psychedelics, right? And it extrapolates to like even like cosmological things. Like quantum physics is really weird and we don't know how to interpret it yet, right? And we don't know what consciousness is. We may have some good ideas, right? But we don't know how consciousness fits within the paradigm of the universe, or whether the universe is conscious itself. Like one of the biggest theories of one of the biggest, if not the biggest scientific theory of consciousness that exists right now, which is enormously rigorous, highly mathematical, is called integrated information theory. And it was started by Julio Tononi. Anil Seth, one of my colleagues, actually writes about that quite well in his new book, Being You, A New Science of Consciousness. Integrated information theory looks at information theory and looks at the integration of different parts of a system, and it quantifies consciousness. And it comes up with a quantifiable metric. It's called phi. And so consciousness is quantifiable. A lot of consciousness, high phi. Low consciousness, like maybe an amoeba, low phi. But more than that, it's almost like panpsychist in its view, and that is like that everything in the universe, atoms, my phone, right? Like everything has some level of consciousness. We don't have any answers to that. That's a really weird, very Eastern, in some Eastern, not other Eastern, way of thinking.
It's also interesting how people who deny that human beings have consciousness, like hard physicalists, like the world is closed onto physics and there's no place for consciousness and just physical laws, and you'll do like zombie theory of man, what I call it, right? Very often we'll say, well, look, animals don't have consciousness, rocks don't have. What makes you think a human being has consciousness? In a sense, that's more comfortable for them to consider that than the opposite alternative, that maybe all of these other things also have consciousness, right?
Right. The opposite. Right. Yeah, exactly. It's the opposite. And it's more comfortable to like sort of, think, I mean, but even not only neuroscience, which is, dealing with the brain, of course, but like even cosmology and astronomy, like, the Big Bang. Now we're going beyond the Big Bang with like the James Webb telescope, figuring out, like looking at the birth of the universe. When I put that in quotes, like we still don't understand questions like what is the edge of the universe? Is there an edge of the universe? Are there other universes, like a multiverse that exists? Are there other, this exact situation happening now in other universes? Those are very unanswered. In other words, the empirical method, the beauty of the scientific method that we discussed earlier to find and figure out how reality works is itself like with quantum physics, relativity, neuroscience, like tearing those boundaries down. And so like it almost does borderline into like really different ways of West, thinking than the West, like the Eastern ways and Eastern philosophies. So
yeah, and it's almost like the branch of philosophy, like metaphysics, right? It's also if you're thinking literally of like what happened, let's say pre-Big Bang or the edge of the universe, those questions by definition will be metaphysical because it's not something that you can measure today with our instruments. Like you have to take that leap into metaphysics, which is really weird.
That is correct. And quantum physics was the first to show that with the measurement problem itself, because it asked what is measurement. You have the act of observation is in measurement, and that's requires some, I guess, level of consciousness. So you have to step into like some other ways of thinking that are more metaphysical and philosophical. So 100%. Yeah, I agree with you.
That stuff is wow.
Yeah, it's crazy. Like, and out of like these ideas, so that's like really what we're talking about here is like you've heard the term woo woo, right? Like the woo woo, like think about like feng shui. Feng shui is a really maybe interesting example, or acupuncture, like the woo woo, the pseudoscience out there, right? So like Karl Popper was one of the first scientists, philosophers of scientists to ask, what distinguishes science from pseudoscience? And continually, like we that distinction, that demarcation, he called it the demarcation problem. Continually to this day, I don't think there's a clear answer, and maybe there's not supposed to be a clear answer. Like I think I read just feng shui, which was considered like woo woo, by a lot of circles, is now like they just did a couple of experiments, and it turns out that like there's some real results there that sort of validate the outcomes of feng shui, if not the ontological explanation of feng shui, like that there's these dragon lines passing through, and there's chi out there.
Yeah, the representational model doesn't have to be true. The representational model explaining the thing, it doesn't have to be true, but the thing itself can be valid. Acupuncture too, there's been studies recently showing that there are real effects on inflammation and so forth, like real hard science. I'll look up, I'll put it as a link to this interview, but I read that recently as well.
Yeah. And you use the word true. And so like, that's the whole point, is what is truth? Is truth objective? Is it relative? Is it somewhere in between? And there's a whole, like, philosophers are really working on that problem, and much better than I can represent their work here. But there's a lot of work.
I have almost like an Aristotelian view on this, on truth. Is that I look at truth from the perspective of the concept of utility. If something is useful, so is it true that meditation works? Well, if it does something useful, then it works. Now, my explanations about meditation could be complete BS, right? Well, my theories, there's the mind and there's this and that. Yeah, that's just me theorizing, okay? But the practice itself is doing something real. To me, it's like if it's true, if there's utility, it's not exactly the same, because some of our representational models are really robust and are really true. We could base future experiments on them and so forth. But if something translates to something real, right, then it's true.
Yeah, that's pragmatism, right? I think in a nutshell, like William James, right? Going back to William James and Dewey and those guys, I think pragmatism, right? Charles Sanders Peirce, and I think some of their work, like that truth is sought in pragmatic application and utility and usefulness and things like that.